Hey kindergarten, it's Mrs. Shivani. Okay, so it's been a while since we've done listening and learning, but I'm excited to get back to it today with a really good story about George Washington. Let's go back to what we learned on Monday though, because that was a while ago. So on Monday, we read about the capital of our country, Washington, D.C. And do you remember who this city is named after? Yes, it's named after George Washington, which was our first president. And a president is a leader that's chosen to be the leader of a country. And the president has a lot of responsibilities because he or she helps to lead the country. Our first president, George Washington, had a lot of special characteristics or qualities that made him a good president. And most good presidents have to have these things. I would think of them like character strengths that we learn in Positivity Project. What kinds of character strengths do you think a good president, a good leader, would need to have? If I had to make a list, I would probably say integrity, which is honesty, and perseverance, bravery, self-control. Those are some I can think of. Let me know if you think of any extras because there's definitely more. But today we're going to learn about George Washington and see how he showed the character strength of honesty, or we also call that integrity, remember. So our title of our story today is A Dishonest Story about an honest man. Okay, so I'll tell you why this is called a dishonest story in a minute. It's a new type of story that we've never read before. But it's a story about how George Washington showed honesty, which is great. So at the end of this lesson, you will be able to name him as someone admired for his honesty, and by him I mean George Washington. And you will also identify the cherry tree story, which is the one we're going to read, as a legend. So let me show you our journal page for the day. Here it is. And this is uploaded on Google Classroom for you, or you might want to just take a screenshot or take a picture or quick draw your own journal on a piece of paper. But this is what you will get to do at the end of our story. In the legend, who cuts down the cherry tree? So listen out for that. Then you'll get to write who forgave him. So he's going to cut down a cherry tree and someone's going to forgive him. George, the cherry tree, or the father? We'll have to see. And then you'll get to draw what happened in the legend. So those are our 3 goals for the day. That's your journal page. We'll come back to this journal page at the end. You ready to read? Okay, get nice and cozied up. Ready? Here we go. Almost everyone likes a good story. Some people especially like true stories that tell how real people did real things. Other people say, I love made-up stories best. A person who tells this kind of story can decide to leave in only the most interesting parts and even make sure there will be a happy ending. However, there is a third kind of story that mixes together true and made-up stories. Today's story is an example of this third type of story, which we call a legend. It is called a dishonest story about an honest man. And remember, if you're honest, that means you're truthful or trustworthy. And if you're dishonest, that means the opposite. That means you make up lies and don't tell real facts about things. This story is about George Washington, a real person, who acts in the story in an honest way as he often acted in real life. The true part of the story is that George Washington was a real person, and he was very honest. The made-up part is about a tree and how he cut it down. So let's read. Augustine Washington loved his farm by the river. He loved the rolling green meadows in which he raised horses and other animals. He loved the woods. He loved the rich soil that allowed him to grow plants for food on the farm or to sell in town. He loved the fruit trees on his farm that gave him beautiful flowers in the spring, delicious fruit for the summer and autumn, and graceful shapes to look at in the winter. So there he is. That's Augustine Washington. Augustine especially loved his cherry trees. When his son George was about 5 years old, so like the same age many of you are, you're 5 or 6, most of you, Augustine said, "George, I will teach you which sorts of cherry trees grow best here and how to take care of them so that they will grow tall and strong and give delicious fruit." So it seems like Augustine's cherry trees were really important to him. I can tell because he wants to find a special place for them, and he wants to tell his son about them. And I know I tell my son things that are really important to me. Oh, let's see what he's doing, peeking out. So, you can imagine how upset Augustine was to find one day that someone had chopped down one of his prized trees. This particular day, he was walking up with his foreman, a man who worked for him and helped run his farm. Augustine said, "This was no accident. Someone cut down this tree on purpose. Look how neat a job of cutting this was. No wild animal could have done that. Who could do such a thing to my tree?" His foreman replied, "I can't imagine who would have the nerve to do it, sir, or the reason." What do you think? Who do you think cut down the tree? Maybe this little guy right here who's peeking. Let's see, let's keep reading. Caught up in their conversation, the two men did not notice little George Washington approaching from the house. The little boy silently listened to the two grown-ups. He looked at his father's face and saw disappointment and anger. George stepped forward, looking pale and worried. To the shock of his father and the foreman, George said quietly but firmly, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the tree with my little axe. I wanted to see if I could do it, but now I know it was a bad idea." Augustine Washington looked at his son. He could see from the expression on his face, that means the look on his face right there, how badly George felt. Meanwhile, the foreman, surprised by the boy's confession, turned back to look at Augustine Washington. He thought, "Mr. Washington sometimes has a very bad temper. Poor George. I hate to think what is about to happen to him." Oh no. Let's keep reading. But to his surprise, he heard the father tell his son, "It was a bad thing to do, George, and you should be punished for doing this. However, I so respect you for coming forward and telling me the truth, that if you promise not to do something like this again, I will not punish you." So what the dad is saying to young George Washington is that he respects him. That means he admires him or thinks well of him. Because when you make a mistake, it's sometimes hard to admit it. That shows a lot of bravery, courage, and that also will earn you a lot of respect too. So that's what the dad is telling to George Washington. "Oh, I promise, Father," said George, and he kept that promise. So you see, even as a young boy, George Washington was honest, and he took responsibility for his actions. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all be like this? Yeah, and I think we can. I know the kids in KA are. We always strive to be respectful. That is the famous legend of George Washington and the cherry tree. It is important to remember that this story about George Washington and the cherry tree is a legend because it is partly true and partly made up. So George Washington was a real person. He was our first president. That part's true, and he was also honest. But the part that is made up is the part about the cherry tree. A few more facts for you. You might ask, was George Washington really an honest man? Actually, he was. After he grew up and became the President of the United States, one of the things for which he was most famous for was his honesty. What is even more interesting is the way people looked up to the real George Washington. That means they respected him. Washington was not perfect. He made mistakes, as everyone does at times. A few times he made decisions that his friends disagreed with. When that happened, they usually said, "We would have chosen differently, but we know he made the choice for a good reason and not just to help himself." It's okay to disagree with your friends, as long as you're respectful to them. Even the King of Great Britain, right here, King George III, admired Washington. His name was George too. After King George lost control of the colonies to the people there, who now thought of themselves as Americans, he expected Washington to make himself king of the new nation. But instead, Washington decided to give up control of the army he led and go back home. When King George, this king, had heard George Washington's plan, he said, if he can do that, he is the greatest man in the world. Remember, he didn't become the king. We don't have a king. This is a different king. It's just a little confusing because they have the same name. But he was our president, George Washington. This was the king of Great Britain because they have kings in Great Britain. In the United Kingdom today. Ooh. Today, we still look up to George Washington. In fact, he is considered one of our greatest national heroes. His face is on the front of a $1 bill and on the front of a quarter. All across America, there are cities, towns, and streets named after him, from Washington, D.C. to even the state of Washington. More than 200 years after he died, some people still ask, what would Washington do when making important decisions? George Washington never chopped down that cherry tree, but he left us something that blossoms brightly in all seasons, the example to be brave and honest. Oh, I love that story. Good one. I know I have some kids in my class who are big historians and are probably loving hearing about George Washington. So quick, before we wrap up, who cut down the cherry tree? It was George Washington, right? Let me see if I can add that in here. George Washington. Whoa, that's pretty big, huh? We better make that smaller. George Washington cut down the cherry tree. And who forgave him? His father. His father forgave him. Not himself, not the cherry tree. And now down here, you can draw what happened in the story, just like we read about. All right, I can't wait to see your responses on Google Classroom, and I love seeing your photos that you send me on Class Dojo too. So keep sending those in. I'm so proud of you guys. We'll be back on Monday with another story about George Washington. And this time we're going to learn how he was very clever. Have a wonderful weekend. Love you guys. Bye, kindergarten.